And my name is Mark Loudon. I'm the director of the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies. And I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to this first of our academic year 2022-2023 virtual lecture series in German American Studies. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Professor Peter Conolly-Smith. And I'll say a little bit about him and then introduce him, and he'll be speaking for about 45 minutes after that. Professor Conolly-Smith is currently on the faculty at the City University of New York, Queens College, where he teaches late 19th and early 20th century social and cultural history with a focus on the United States. He received his undergraduate training in Berlin at the Freie Universität, where he grew up and where his mother is still living. And this would have been during the Cold War era. He came to the United States, specifically to Yale University, to conduct his graduate work. He earned his MA and PhD there. He's the author of Translating America, an immigrant press visualizes American popular culture from 1895 to 1918. And the title of his presentation is somewhat similar. It's New York's German American Press in Times of Peace and War, from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries, and specifically wrapping up in 1918. So just a quick reminder before I turn the floor over to Professor Conolly-Smith. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat, but put them in the Q&A, and I will be reading them for Professor Conolly-Smith about 45 minutes after the hour when he wraps up his formal presentation. And then we'll take about 25-30 minutes. We'll have about 25 or 30 minutes to answer your questions. So with that, Professor Conolly-Smith, welcome virtually to the Max Kade Institute. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's great to be here. And thank you to Antje, Petty, Mark at the Max Kade Institute, everyone for inviting me, making this possible today. I've always wanted to come to Madison, so this is the closest I've been so far. So we're one virtual step in the right direction. Without any further elaborate preliminaries and introductory comments, I'm just going to jump right in, and I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. That will just take 1 second. You should be seeing a slide right now with the title of my talk, New York City's German American Press in Times of Peace and War. And so what I want to do is basically, this was my first academic love, so to speak. It's been a while since I've really immersed myself in this subject, but I remember it well. It's the subject of my dissertation and my book. So what I'd like to do is take you into the crowded landscape of the German language press in New York around the turn of the century. And it is a very crowded landscape. So, you know, there are the weeklies and dailies numbered in the double digits easily, both in the late 19th century in New York. So I'm going to try to introduce you to this cultural environment by way of 3 newspapers. The first being the oldest and most venerable of the New York German dailies, the Yorker Staats-Zeitung. You've probably heard of it. And its arch nemesis and rival, the Yorker Volkszeitung, the socialist Volkszeitung, which I will also be looking at closely. And then in order to round out the picture, I will also be talking about a lesser known German newspaper, but a very important one, the William Randolph Hearst-owned New Yorker Deutsches Journal, which was sister publication to Hearst's more famous English language New York Morning, later Evening Journal, and later still the New York American. And then to further round out the picture, I'm going to try to not only talk about these 3 newspapers in relation to each other, but also to the larger cultural landscape of New York's press in general. And for that purpose, I will be nodding to the Forverts, now called the Jewish Daily Forward, an all too brief nod, I should say, but I'm going to try to bring it in, as well as the mass circulating yellow press of Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And then to conclude, so there's the Forverts, and here's Pulitzer and Hearst, who will all be showing up in the talk to come. And to conclude, I will be taking us into World War I, and we'll look at the decline of the immigrant press and how these 3 or 4 newspapers fared after 1917. So let me begin with the first of them, the New Yorker Staats-Zeitung, which was created in 1834 as a joint stock company under the leadership of one Adolf Neumann. Initially a weekly publication with a circulation of 2,000, subscriptions cost $6 a year, advertising, which was strictly text-based, no images, was 3 pennies a line. Under Neumann, the newspaper was prone to editorializing, which is quite typical for the German and, I would say, foreign language press in general. Even when ostensibly covering the news, there's always some kind of rhetorical edge to the reportage in the 19th century immigrant press that makes it unmistakably clear, here's what we really think. By 1845, Neumann had taken full ownership of the entire stock, its circulation now 5,000. And it was appearing thrice weekly when he sold out in 1845 to Jakob Uhl, who, assisted by his wife Anna Uhl, was a skilled typesetter and offered in-depth reportage of the 1848 uprisings in Germany, which aroused enormous interest in the immigrant community, and as you know, also brought a wave of emigres, refugees from the 1848 revolutions to America's shores who had an outsized influence on American culture, German-American culture, and the German-American press, including our newspapers, as we'll see. So hold on, I just lost my spot. Uhl ended up dying in 1852, and Anna Uhl, his wife, continued the business with the assistance of a young 48er who'd fled to New York and found employment at the Staats-Zeitung in 1852. His name, famous name, Oswald Ottendorfer. In 1859, they wed and became the 19th century's German-American power couple par excellence. Here they are, Frau Anna, as she was affectionately known, and Oswald Ottendorfer. The 1860s and 70s were the newspaper's glory days, its unstoppable rise evident in a state-of-the-art building that it purchased in 1857 in what is now Park Row at 17 Chatham Street, Newspaper Row, as it was even then known in downtown New York. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, the Staats-Zeitung was the acknowledged, unrivaled German daily of record in New York, and indeed the entire United States. It was bourgeois in political persuasion and Germanocentric in cultural orientation, with a daily circulation exceeding 50,000 by the end of the century. Following Ottendorfer's death in 1900, for Anna had already died in 1884. The newspaper was purchased by one of its major stockholders, Hermann Ritter. Here he is, under whom its daily circulation peaked at around 70,000, which is really amazing if you think about it. 70,000 newspapers sold daily, and it's only one of over a dozen German language dailies. But then it began its steady decline following Ritter's own death in 1915. By that time, the Staats-Zeitung not only had competition, but also far bigger problems. Of course, 1915, most obviously the increasingly anti-German atmosphere in the wake of that spring's Lusitania crisis. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let me return you to the 19th century and briefly explain the formula of the Staatszeitung's success. The Staatszeitung represented the solid mainstream medium of a maturing immigrant group. Every immigrant press had them. Il Progresso Italo-Americano, the Irish Echo, and so on. These are the agenda-setting newspapers of the immigrant group. Such newspapers maintained close ties with their readers' country of origin, either reprinting articles culled from publications there or maintaining correspondence of their own, as the Staatszeitung was able to afford to do after 1890. The Staatszeitung stimulated its readership's imagined sense of Germanness by offering extensive coverage of current events there, and also by way of travelogues, sentimental poetry, and diasporic fiction, especially, but not only on Sundays. At the same time, it encouraged an insular, ethnocentric view of New York and the United States, devoting much space to local Greater New York ethnic associations, whose comings and goings the newspaper reported faithfully on a daily basis, organized by borough. as seen here. And I know this is a poor reproduction, I apologize. Some of the reproductions you're going to see are, but it's good enough for you to make out, recognize the headings: news from Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Ethnic Associations from Long Island, in slightly smaller font, from New Jersey, Queens, and other deutsche Kreise, aus deutschen Kreisen, from German circles. The newspaper referred to these German-speaking Staatszeitungen reading circles as its, quote, community of readers, unquote. You'll notice how austere the layout is, by the way. 7 columns of relentless type. Almost every single page of the Staatszeitung looked like this long after the technical capabilities existed to incorporate illustrations, photographs, or composite illustrations that featured elements both hand-drawn and photographic, stylistic choices, or that the Staatszeitung resisted until well into the 20th century. While I do not know this for a fact, I conjecture that the Staatszeitung resisted such elements because it associated them with modernity and hence with Americanness. So this austere layout, it was as kind of a visual and cultural protective armor against the imagined threat of the host society's cultural incursions. This cultural conservatism found its counterpart in a distinct political conservatism too. If the Staatszeitung had started out as a newspaper that supported the failed liberal revolutions of 1848, a newspaper run in its glory days by Oswald Ottendorfer, who was himself a former revolutionary of the 48er generation, the newspaper had by the 1870s abandoned these once cherished principles. Ottendorfer's success aligned him with the moneyed classes of the German-American community, with people like piano manufacturer William Steinway, formerly Steinweg, whose already imposing factory of the late 1860s had, by the 1870s, morphed into a veritable company town. Steinway Village in present-day Long Island City, where his workers, or when his workers rather, joined the 8-hour day movement, Steinway wasted no time enlisting his friend Oswald Ottendorfer in a vicious campaign portraying the strikers as militant communists who planned to overthrow New York's moneyed class. His smear campaign a success, the politically influential Ottendorfer used his connections to mobilize the police force, who broke the strike in a series of bloody clashes in front of Steinway's factory in the summer of 1872, all approvingly reported on by the Staatszeitung itself. By the time the dust had settled, former 48er Oswald Ottendorfer had reinvented himself into a key member of New York's German-American business and political elite, and his Staatszeitung into the unchallenged voice of the community's upper and middle class. Of course, the majority of Germans in New York were neither upper nor middle class, but this hardly mattered, nor made any difference to the Staatszeitung circulation, which by this time had already approached the 50,000 mark. I think a big part of its appeal to working class readers may have been vicarious, right? The Staatszeitung society pages, which covered the events attended by the social elite, offered an ersatz reality to working men and women that may have helped ease the hardships of 19th century working class life. More significantly, perhaps, there was no real working class alternative yet. Mid-19th century efforts to establish a lasting German language class-conscious workers' paper, there had been several such efforts dating back to 1850, had all failed to take root, but this was to change in 1878 with the birth of the New Yorker Volkszeitung, dedicated to the interests of the working people, as its masthead proudly proclaimed. The Volkszeitung launched in January of 1878 with oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a sentence. Far less is known about the Volkszeitung than the Staatszeitung. Dispensaries, orphanages, branches of the New York Public Library were named for Anna and Oswald Ottendorfer, whereas the names associated with the early history of the socialist Volkszeitung, Adolf Due, for example, or Alexander Jonas, are known only to historians of American socialism and labor. They launched the Volkszeitung in January of 1878 with $1,000 in seed money donated by the German-dominated Socialist Labor Party, the SLP. But finding the SLP's scope too ethnocentric, the always internationalist-oriented Volkszeitung in 1899 instead switched affiliation to the less German immigrant-dominated, more moderate American Socialist Party, whose candidates, both local and national, such as Eugene Debs, shown here at left, the newspaper faithfully endorsed. Note endorsement here. This affiliation too ended in a break, however, over the newspaper's frustration with what it called the fossilization and mental paralysis of this most inconsequential socialist paper in the world and its increasing apparent shift to bourgeois values. Following this break and an equally uneasy flirtation with Soviet Bolshevism, the Volkszeitung as of 1919 lived out the remainder of its existence until 1932 as an independent radical newspaper with a circulation of 20,000. In visual appearance, the Volkszeitung resembled the Staats-Zeitung. It too featured 7 columns of type with few, if any, illustrations until well into the 20th century. Like the Staats-Zeitung too, the Volkszeitung claimed a community of readers, though one organized not by ethnic association, but by union affiliation. The New Yorker Volkszeitung is the official organ of the following unions and affiliates of the Socialist Party, the newspaper proudly proclaimed, and followed with a list of over 200 such organizations. Outings, picnics, festivals, and cultural events organized and advertised by the newspaper reinforced this sense of belonging, and by the mid-19-teens, such Volkszeitungs-sponsored events were a firmly established part of New York's working-class culture. The newspaper sought to structure not only the leisure time activities of its imagined community, but every aspect of its daily life via devices such as the annual Pioneer Calendar, a month-by-month calendar available for sale from the newspaper's Spruce Street Cooperative Press headquarters. The calendar listed events established long in advance, such as the annual May Day parade, for example, but also provided ample room to pencil in hopefully socialist-oriented activities day by day. The over 100 pages of annual supplements contain both instructive essays, according to the ad, belehrende Aufsätze, and tales and novellas, Erzählungen und Novellen. These included German classics such as Goethe, Schiller, Heine, and in an illustration of the newspaper's all-important internationalist thrust, translated serializations of Jack London, Anatole France, essays by G.B. Shaw, and, as seen here, hard to make out, a short story by Anton Chekhov, his name spelled in the German fashion, T-S-C-H-E-C-H-O-W. Such short stories whose juxtaposition on the page to the immediately adjacent News from the Unions column, Gewerkschaften und Vereine, and its position adjacent to the Socialist Agitation column, Sozialistische Agitation, one more over to the right, reinforced visually on the level of layout the newspaper's worldview of life as a holistic socialist experience in which culture, society, politics, and everyday life all coalesced into one big socialist Gesamtkunstwerk. The Volkszeitung and Staats-Zeitung were acutely aware of each other and engaged in an ongoing, hostile, often comical rapport. The Volkszeitung was a silver-tongued snake in the grass, according to the Staats-Zeitung, which was itself derided by its socialist rival as the most stupid and insidious German daily in New York, run by Lumpengesindel, a pack of blackguards. Conservative and stodgy, the newspaper, the Staats-Zeitung, was on good days referred to by its socialist rival as unsere Staatstante, our stately aunt, and on other occasions as a Janus-faced hypocrite given to ceaseless incendiary nagging. Yet, for all this mutual hostility, the two newspapers actually had much in common. While neither of them would have wanted to admit it, there unquestionably existed between them a degree of reciprocal influence and inspiration. Both claimed to champion the high culture of the old world, and both rejected American popular culture. Both advanced community-forming agendas, and both resorted to similar types of rhetoric, regularly invoking images of a community of readers. The fact is, although they referred to each other as opposites, the two newspapers were actually foils. As founding editor Alexander Jonas observed, we can hope for sustained success only if workers find in their newspapers the same basic news items run by other newspapers, in particular those in the Staats-Zeitung. In fact, in order to, hold on, I'm missing What I like, about this comment of Alexander Jonas is that it acknowledges the degree to which survival in the world of 19th century ethnic newspapers depended on adaptability. In fact, in order to succeed, an ethnic newspaper had to not only emulate those features of its ethnic rival publications that helped them succeed, but also features of the mass circulating English language press. And this realm, that of the mass circulating English language press, was at the time dominated by rival yellow press barons Joseph Pulitzer, owner-publisher of the New York World, and his arch-rival and nemesis, William Randolph Hearst, owner-publisher of the New York Morning, later Evening Journal. These two yellow press lords' innovations were many, too many to list here, and though distasteful to their German language contemporaries' cultural and political sensibility, they were innovations that did eventually find their way into the pages of the German ethnic press. I will enumerate just a few of these innovations. They included a lowering of the cover price, an increase in the size of font and headlines, the inclusion of sports and women's pages, and generally entertainment-oriented material of a specifically American nature. Movies, vaudeville, the Broadway stage, all cultural phenomena that both the Volkszeitung and Staats-Zeitung deplored. And perhaps most impactful, a far more visual appeal that made liberal use of visual advertising introduced by Joseph Pulitzer that sometimes covered multiple columns and featured half or even full-page illustrations, often accompanied by large font, a decided departure from the agate size font previously used for ads that for decades had been limited to just one column in width. And still on the subject of the yellow press's use of the visual, illustrations, photographs, editorial cartoons, and comic strips. Oh yes, comic strips. After all, as any newspaper historian knows, the yellow press got its name from Hearst and Pulitzer's rivalry over America's first proto-comic strip character, the Yellow Kid, who first appeared in The World and later was pirated by Hearst and appeared in the Journal, and then in both publications simultaneously. That's a different story. In sum, the yellow press's appeal was overwhelmingly visual, as seen here in a typical front page of the New York World circa 1900. And whether they liked it or not, the German language Volkszeitung and Staatszeitung had to concede how popular this approach was. Indeed, between them, Pulitzer's World and Hearst's Journal claimed a shared daily readership of over 1 million readers. Immigrants, attracted to the yellow press's use of simple language, bold headlines, and illustrations, defected from their publications in large numbers. Writes Karl Wittke, historian of the German language press, it was, quote, only ethnic publishers who learned to emulate the patterns of the American commercial dailies who could expect to meet their competition, end quote. Now, one such ethnic publisher was Abraham Kahan, who, according to Michael Schutzen, quote, pruned his Yiddish-language Forverts of difficult expressions, introduced English words most immigrants would know, and tried to make his paper bright, simple, and interesting, as he had learned to do while working with Lincoln Steffens on the Commercial Advertiser. Now, before that, Kahan, who arrived in the Lower East Side from Belarus in 1882 as a committed socialist and union man, had contributed to two Yiddish language radical dailies, the Arbeiter Zeitung und Die Zukunft. And although he was among the founding members of the Forward in 1897, he maintained a 4-year distance from that newspaper while it sorted out, the Forverts, its prickly relationship with the same Socialist Labor Party, or SLP, that had also provided the seed money for the Volkszeitung. During that time, Kahan worked at the English language New York Commercial Advertiser, as I mentioned just a minute ago, under the tutelage of legendary muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens, who remembered him as, quote, an East Side Russian socialist who made incessant Marxist propaganda among us. So it was at an English language publication that Kahan cut his teeth before returning to the Forverts in 1901 to assume its leadership with, quote, full editorial control, according to his later memoir. And that influence of working for the English language, the more mass circulating dailies, showed. While the inclusion of the English language words that you see here in this representation are an imperfect example of Kahan's frequent code switching, as they're for the most part brand and manufacturers' names from the realm of advertising. It's nevertheless interesting to see how the forward, and notice its masthead's inclusion of its name in Yiddish and both English and German. So it's really going for the broadest possible readership here. It's interesting to see how the Forverts had adapted to the convention of multi-column illustrated advertising introduced by Pulitzer some years earlier. In fact, Kahan, while taking many cues from the American press, took as many from the established ethnic press, sharing with the Staats and the Volkszeitung their community forming agendas, for example. And this he did most famously with his Bintelbrief advice column, in which he personally and later had his staff answer each in the bundle of letters, the Bintelbrief, received daily throughout his long tenure. And to this day, these letters to the editor, as well as the responses, form a really interesting tapestry of testimonials about life in the Lower East Side for the Jewish American union-oriented community around the turn of the century. He also operated by way of negative appeal when necessary, famously so in his Gallery of Lost Husbands feature, in which he tried to shame wayward husbands into returning to their wives by publishing their likenesses in the pages of the forward. This shows us not only an unusual example of Kahan's effort to maintain the integrity of the community, but also his enthusiasm, again, for the use of imagery, illustration, and photographs. According to Moses Rishin, Kahan's use, I'm quoting, of illustrated Sunday supplements, headlines, and feature materials earned him the sobriquet, the Yiddish Brisbane, a reference to Arthur Brisbane, then editor of William Randolph Hearst's New York Evening Journal, which brings us finally to William Randolph Hearst and the third and last of our three German language newspapers. We will briefly return to Kahan a little later. Now, Hearst had arrived in New York in 1895, fresh on the heels of his success in California with the San Francisco Examiner, and he arrived with the explicit purpose of dethroning Pulitzer. And he did so by hiring away much of Pulitzer's talent, including the artist who drew the Yellow Kid. This is all sort of a famous story. Unbeknownst to Hearst, and this is less well known, at the time of his purchase of the journal, the newspaper came with a German language sister publication, the Morgenjournal. This was an odd but not unheard of thing, that an English language publication might have foreign language sister publications. Informed of this fact, Hearst is to have commented, "So I bought a Frankfurter too," a quote that might be apocryphal. The German language newspaper quickly adjusted to its publisher's philosophy and style, as well as populist politics, and by the early 19-teens, it routinely parroted the opinions expounded in the English language journal, by then called the New York American, and sometimes reprinted verbatim translations of editorials penned by Hearst Lieutenant Brisbane and frequently by Hearst himself. The close association between the German journal and its controversial publisher was the source of much criticism within the ranks of New York's German language press. The socialist Volkszeitung, for example, denigrated the newspaper as, quote, a Hearst-owned German language puddle of muck, and Hearst himself as the Yellow Willy. The Staats-Zeitung, in turn, called the journal, quote, a sensationalist rag of cheesecloth. The association with Hearst that its rivals cited in order to tarnish its reputation, the journal itself wore as a badge of honor. More than any other German-American newspaper, the German journal observed of itself in 1915, self-advertisement being one of the hallmarks of yellow journalism, the deutsches Journal is capable of completely replacing an English language publication, as it has access through its connection to the New York American to all resources of a major American daily. This connection, it wrote, allowed the journal to embody an American point of view like no other German language paper. Compared to the explicitly ethnocentric focus of the Staats-Zeitung and the exclusively class-based appeal of the Volkszeitung, the journal's self-claimed American point of view signaled a self-conscious alternative. Now, this is not to suggest that the journal was content to be a mere transliteration of an existing English language newspaper. On the contrary, it is its hybrid nature part American, part German American, that makes of the journal such a fascinating publication. As much pride as the newspaper took in its Americanness, it took equal pride in its claim to German ethnic authenticity. Like the Staats-Zeitung, the journal listed and covered in detail the meetings, activities, and cultural events of Greater New York's German immigrant clubs and organizations, and at the same time, given its publishers not exactly socialist, but well-established populist politics, the journal offered guardedly pro-labor reportage and positioned itself as a champion of the working class. Why does the Volkszeitung hate us? The journal asked rhetorically, and then answered, quote, because it lost its reason for being once we came into existence. The Volkszeitung scoffed at such claims and in a rare editorial cartoon portrayed Hearst as a capitalist whose philanthropy served only to keep labor shackled in servitude. Yet the mere fact that the Volkszeitung should resort to such an American form of visual dissent as a cartoon image with a speech bubble, no less, an innovation in American comic art explicitly associated with the Hearst press, indicates the degree to which Hearst was making inroads into the formerly conservative representational strategies of its rivals, forcing them to adapt. By this time, the Staats-Zeitung too ran occasional cartoons, and both the Staats-Zeitung and the Volkszeitung by then also featured multi-column ads with large font English language catchphrases and illustrations. Indeed, of the many innovations that Hearst, following Pulitzer, introduced to publishing, perhaps none impacted on the ethnic press as meaningfully as their emphasis on visual representation. And among his most popular incarnations of the visual during this period were the comics. Comics were fabulously popular, and they were fabulously popular among immigrants. They were often about immigrants. They were frequently produced by immigrants. However, the journal alone among German language dailies carried comic strips, which, thanks to its association with the Hearst press, it could reproduce at nominal cost. All of the Hearst classics were there, not only the original Yellow Kid and his demonic German accented prankster cousins, the Katzenjammer Kids, but also such famous, originally Irish ne'er-do-wells as Jigs of bringing up Father Fame, and Happy Hooligan, both here translated into German, which had an odd effect. Not only the content of their speech bubbles, but the characters themselves became German in the pages of the German journal, and thus Happy Hooligan, for example, became Hannes, a German language vernacularism denoting a person of German heritage, while Jigs, that incorrigible Irish bricklayer turned millionaire, became Herr Gradmichel, a German language pun that roughly translated means upstanding German. These characters constantly getting into trouble for their undignified behavior, Jigs for his drinking, Happy for his frequent brushes with the law, were by virtue of their translation into Germans, here serving as negative exemplars to the German readers on how not to act. If you do not wish to end up in trouble with your wife, like Jigs, or do not wish to end up in trouble with the law, like Happy, then do not act like them. The most jarring example of this negative logic was supplied by Hearst's most famous comic strip, The Katzenjammer Kid, in which the anarchic twins Hans and Fritz terrorized their elders, the rotund hirsute Captain und die Mama, acts of filial disrespect for which they were routinely punished. Poking fun at German mannerisms, speech, and appearance, even in their original, the Katzenjammer Kids were the most powerful of the German journal's negative comic exemplars. Here's what you look like to Americans, the strip said to its German readers, to whom it held up the warped mirror of American ethnic stereotypes. This is what you sound like. This is what they think you dress like. If you wish to be accepted as equal, if you wish to integrate, which by virtue of reading an American-owned newspaper, you are already signaling you do, then stop conforming to type. And what better way to prove that this is not who you are than by laughing at it, rather than by taking offense, as did the Staats-Zeitung, which in a rare pun of its own referred to the Katzenjammer Kids, but too defensively, as bejammernswert, deplorable, and in so doing proved that the stereotype still cut close enough to the bone to offend. To be able to laugh at your former self, on the other hand, the way a reader of the journal's comics did, to find humor in the way you once were but no longer wished to be, signaled your arrival in a way, your rebirth as American. And to opt out of the narrowly defined worlds of the exclusively ethnocentric or exclusively class-conscious Staats-Zeitung and Volkszeitung, and instead embrace the broader scope of vision offered by the Americanized and Americanizing lens of Hearst's German journal, was to take a decisive step in that direction. Just take a look at the changing masthead of the journal. This was its masthead originally when Hearst first bought it in 1895. Having under this masthead established itself as the most American of New York's German language dailies, the newspaper in 1912 changed its name to Deutsches Journal, literally the German journal, perhaps to reassure its more conservative readers that it remained at heart German. This title it kept throughout the period of American neutrality during World War I, and after the United States entered the war, the paper then sought to tone down its Germanness by inserting between the two words an American eagle whose wings spread across the stars and stripes. The newspaper tempered this iconographic Americanization of the masthead with 4 smaller banners bearing the banners of Germany, right? Where's my cursor? Right there. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Switzerland, the German-speaking countries, and the somewhat ambivalent subtitle, America's Greatest German Newspaper. 6 months later, in November 1917, all ambivalence was cast to the wind as the newspaper renamed itself the New Yorker Deutsches Journal, with the word Deutsches now tiny in comparison to the other 3 and demoted to a position beneath that of the eagle. All banners save for the American had disappeared, and most blatantly, the subtitle now read, an American paper printed in German in behalf of American unity and universal democracy. Now, we've reached part 3 of the story. Ethnic newspapers responded to America's entry into the war in different ways. October 1917's Trading with the Enemy Act required that, quote, any news item, editorial, or other printed matter respecting the government of the United States or of any nation engaged in the present war, its policies, international relations, the state or conduct of the war, or any matter relating thereto, be vetted, end quote, by government censors prior to publication. An absurd requirement, as virtually every news item in October 1917 somehow or another related to the war. Some papers, to be sure, 650 in all nationwide, were issued a permit exempting them from the cumbersome and expensive process of filing virtually all their reportage with a local postmaster for clearance. These were the New York Timeses and other established loyal papers who stood above suspicion. But for other smaller suspect publications, publications that often relied heavily on mail subscriptions and that included many foreign language newspapers as well as socialist and other radical publications, the law basically amounted to a death sentence. And dozens, nay, hundreds, literally thousands of newspapers caved in or were forced into bankruptcy, which was, in fact, at one level, the objective of the law, to silence voices of dissent. Making matters worse for foreign language publications, they had to file notarized translations of all war-related material with local postmasters to be vetted by translators in local post offices who checked the submissions for accuracy before even considering whether or not the material was to be approved. Despite the large numbers of translators working in the New York City post office's German and Jewish divisions, shown here, the German and Jewish divisions are the ones in the middle of this remarkable diagram. And we had 9 translators each working on the German and Jewish press. Still, the turnaround was painfully and intentionally slow. So by the time a newspaper was able to finally publish a given article, its relevance had long since passed. The only alternative, other than the much coveted permits, was to agree to publish only pre-approved government circulated material made available on a daily basis, which basically amounted to self-imposed government censorship. Now, our 4 newspapers each responded to the challenge of the times in different ways. The Staats-Zeitung traded on its prestige and succeeded in scoring a permit of exemption, which it reproduced on the front page of each issue for the remainder of the war, a proud badge of its loyalty. Abraham Kahan, called to testify as to why he should not see the, by now, daily forward mailing privilege revoked, caved into the pressure. The day before the law went into effect, he agreed, according to the New York Times, that, quote, his paper would hereafter refrain from any discussion of the war. Hereafter, said Mr. Kahan, we will print the news of the war, by which he meant government-sanctioned items, but will avoid all discussion of it. That the old warrior still had some fight left in him is indicated by the final words of his statement: since thinking and having your own opinion without expressing it has not yet been considered unlawful, we will just print war news without comment, but think our own part to ourselves, supposedly. The Volkszeitung, on the other hand, refused to compromise, and even though it faithfully submitted dozens of notarized translations, saw its second-class mailing privileges revoked, leading to the loss of 5,000 subscribers. Looking back from the vantage point of 1928, the newspaper described this as the most difficult period of its existence. Nevertheless, and despite its loss in subscribers, newsstand sales of the Volkszeitung pulled it through, and it managed to limp to the finish line of World War I with its head held high, which leaves Hearst's journal. The journal did not receive a permit, nor any of the Hearst papers. Long a thorn in the side of the Wilson administration, Hearst papers had to submit all war-related materials to the censor, but in a minor windfall, the bulk of the German journal's materials that required translations, news stories, pictures, and commentary on the war had, since the United States' entry into the hostilities, been verbatim translations of the same items run in Hearst's New York American. So all the newspaper really had to do was send the English language original to the government for verification. This gave it a slight edge over other foreign language newspapers in terms of the turnaround period, and the German journal could have proceeded relatively unencumbered through the end of the war had it chosen, but decided not to. In an unexpected decision that caught the readership entirely unawares, the newspaper posted a front-page announcement on April 21st, 1918, following the first 4 paragraphs in which it asserted its unswerving loyalty to the principles of American democracy and unity. The newspaper unveiled its course of action. The time has now come when this newspaper believes it should make its supreme sacrifice in behalf of American unity. It therefore makes the following announcement: the New Yorker Deutsches Journal will, after this issue, suspend publication as a daily and Sunday newspaper printed in the German language. All unexpired subscriptions will be refunded immediately, and all advertising contracts are hereby cancelled as of this date, April 21, 1918. And just like that, 50,000 readers and subscribers to one of New York's leading German language dailies were left homeless. A dramatic and wholly unexpected gesture, to be sure, but one that also made a certain kind of sense, as we shall see. By the way, the very same day the journal announced that it was closing down, the Staats-Zeitung immediately made an overt play for those 50,000 now homeless readers, posting a front-page announcement of its own. The bilingual announcement to the news dealers stated, "The Deutsches Journal having suspended publication, we would appreciate your recommendation of the Staats-Zeitung to the former readers of the Deutsches Journal." Amazing, right? One newspaper's brazen grab for another's readership, and they didn't even wait for the corpse to cool. But what's even more interesting than this naked power grab, is that it failed, because you see, NWAs and other such sources indicate no corresponding bump in the Staatszeitung's readership, which on the contrary had already begun its decline at this point. So what happened? And where are they today? The Staatszeitung continues on today as a weekly, published via internet. A mere shadow of its former self, its decline began even before the end of the war, its circulation shrinking despite its being among the very few German language newspapers to receive a permit. Perhaps it was the overdetermined manner in which it now expressed its wartime loyalty to America that alienated a readership to whom it had long preached an ethnocentric self-image. Who knows? What we do know is that it was forced to merge with a lesser German daily, the Herold, in the post-war period, but that did little to slow its decline. The Ritter family, who'd owned the newspaper since 1900, but whose patriarch died in 1915, became heavily involved in the emerging Knight Ritter chain of English language newspapers in the post-war period, and appears to have lost interest in what was once its flagship publication. The paper was sold in the 1950s, again in the 1980s, and today only exists in its weekly virtual format. Kahan's foreword switched to English in 1990, and as of very recently went from broadsheet to tabloid format. Having long since thrown the word daily out of its title, it is now published thrice weekly as the Forward. Still center-left, if moderately so. The beginning of its moderation can be traced to Kahan's decision to publish government-sanctioned war news in World War I, and culminated in its embrace of candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal agenda throughout the 1930s. The Volkszeitung soldiered on with an ever-declining circulation until 1928, many of its former contributors also joining the New Deal coalition, in a further sign of the increasing moderation of the American left during the Great Depression, which leaves the journal. So what happened with the journal? Well, although the first to fold, the journal had the last laugh. Because what did happen to those 50,000 readers? I would like to turn in conclusion to Robert E. Park, founding member of the University of Chicago's Department of Sociology, who as a young man had actually worked as a cub reporter for Hearst's New York Journal, and there developed an appreciation for its thrust. Later, of course, he becomes the dean of American immigrant newspapers and the ethnic press, writing amongst other tomes, The Immigrant Press and Its Control. And in a lesser known but wonderful essay that I strongly recommend called The Natural History of the Newspaper, he enumerated the many ways in which he believed the Hearst Press recruited new readers via headlines, advertising, its comic strips and illustrations. I'll quote from the essay. Even men who can perhaps read no more than the headlines in the daily press will buy a Sunday paper to look at the pictures, Park writes, including in particular, quote, the immigrant who has perhaps acquired the newspaper habit from reading a foreign language newspaper and who is eventually attracted to the native American newspapers. They are for him a window looking out into the larger world outside of the narrow circle of the immigrant community. He goes in for the pictures, first in black and white and then in color, then follows the comic section and all the other devices with which we are familiar for compelling the public to read. In this manner, Park concludes, quote, Mr. Hearst has been a great Americanizer. It is said that the most successful of his papers, the New York Evening Journal, gains a new body of subscribers every 6 years. Apparently, it gets its readers from many immigrants. They graduate into Mr. Hearst's papers from the foreign language press, end quote. And so my contention is that maybe in this case, it was Hearst's foreign language newspaper that the readers graduated from into his newspaper, because according to NWAs, the Evening Journal did indeed see a bump of over 100,000 readers post-war. So following Park's argument, I will speculate that many of the German journal's former readers were among those numbers. After years of being inundated with Hearst's sensationalism, his headlines, his editorials, his comic strips, what more logical place to go after their German language Hearst paper closed down than to its English language equivalent? I can never prove this, of course. But that's my story, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm sticking with it. So thank you very much. And I would love to open this now to questions and comments.
Great, Peter, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start off with a question here. And again, folks, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A and I'll read them out for Peter. So this is coming from Yogi Retman in Northfield, Minnesota. And he writes, Gerhard Seeger was born in 1896 and died in 1967, edited the Neue Volkszeitung in New York. He was a former member of the Reichstag and emigrated to the United States in 1934 due to his opposition to the regime. As vice president of the German-American Congress for Democracy, he spoke widely, including a visit to New Ulm, Minnesota, where he spoke at meetings there. Do you know if his papers have been preserved or if anything has been written about his life in the U.S.?
Well, unfortunately, I must say that I do not, and nor have I heard of, so thank you for this, of the Neue Volkszeitung. That's very interesting. He sounds like a fascinating character, but unfortunately, I'm drawing a blank there. Regrets. Thank you, Yogi.
Next question is coming from me. The first question from me, got a few. I've been fascinated, by training a linguist and have been interested in, been working a lot with historical German language newspapers, including a little bit further back in time, the early 19th century. And been fascinating with the medium of the dialogue, the Gespräch, often a political thing. So like, A argues with B about political matters or religious matters or social mores or anything like that. Was the in the later 19th and early 20th century, was the dialogue, the Gespräch, a genre that you're familiar with in the newspapers you've worked with in New York?
Not that I recall. What was a genre were these, and this is pretty common among in the press in general around the turn of the century, quips, sort of one-liners, but not never sort of arranged in any form, dialogue form that would sort of simulate a coherent conversation, but rather sort of just these are often in the bottom right hand of the editorial page, just sort of humorous observations about the daily current newsworthy events. And another genre, but also not what you're looking for, was the dialect column, right? Often, so we have Finlay Peter Dunn in the English language press, sort of simulating an Irish brogue, Mr. Dooley. And there were German language equivalents of that in Saxon, in Hessian, in various dialects. But again, that is not what you're looking for, so I won't go on.
Actually, it's included. I'm interested in that too. I think that's fascinating.
So that was definitely still a thing as late as the 20th century.
And along those lines, dialect is also used in a negative context to describe so-called broken English or broken German, where it's like, the two languages influencing one another. I believe the Staats-Zeitung had a fairly puristic line about not wanting to mix English and German, particularly. Is that your perception too?
That is my,
unlike the Vorwärts.
yeah, that is indeed my perception. But I have to tell you that they definitely did start, the English language words did start sneaking in, especially around the 19-teens and even more so with the war. And during the war, Hermann Ritter also introduced, remember he died in 1915, so he was around for the first year or so, and he introduced a new feature, which I forget the exact title, but it was an English language supplement, which was basically the German perspective on the war. Because during the period of neutrality, you could still take Germany's side, and many did, not only the Germans, the Irish, some of the less radical Jewish immigrants who were opposed to the Tsar and therefore opposed to the Allies. So there was quite a lot of opposition to the Allies, and therefore a lot of sort of tacit and sometimes explicit support for the Central Powers and for Germany. And so he produced a daily supplement, quite elaborate, of more than a page in length, which was overtly pro-German coverage of the news in English. Just he said to educate our neighbors of what's really going on, because the idea was that what the most of the English language press was carrying, the middle of the road press, was all propaganda as far as Ritter was concerned.
Great. We've got a few more questions here. This one's coming from Charles James here in Madison. To what extent did the New York German newspapers communicate with or even influence German newspapers in other cities like Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Louis?
Yeah, so I said earlier that this was my first love, and I've since strayed. But I have become interested again in these newspapers, and I found that they had an interesting dialogue going on with some of the California German newspapers. Unfortunately, the name of the newspaper eludes me. It's the Anzeiger or some Bay Area newspaper, I think based in Oakland, and it was a pretty big newspaper. And what happened in 1915 as well is that the World's Fair opened in San Francisco that year. It was the Panama World's Exposition that was commemorating the previous year's 1914's opening of the Panama Canal, right? So they had it in San Francisco because, to get to San Francisco, you can now go through the Panama Canal. And there had been, like for all World's Fair, a great deal of excitement about, all the nations of the world coming for a visit. But because the war had recently broken out, all the chief belligerents failed to show up. That's Austria, England, Russia, France, and Germany, amongst others. And so these German newspapers, the California-based newspaper, which had a local axe to grind, got in touch with the New York newspapers, which were seen as the more influential and closer to Germany, both in spirit as well as geographically. And they made a joint, they had a joint campaign in which they basically petitioned the German government to come to San Francisco regardless of the war. And so I know that there was very close cooperation. Both the Staats-Zeitung and the Journal, which themselves competed for bragging rights as to which had more pull in Germany, hosted these California Germans who came to New York and shared their insights. And these were newspapermen themselves. And there was a real joint effort. So that's the only specific example I can think of. But generally speaking, I think all of these German language newspapers in the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century, they were very much aware of each other, and they often cited each other, quoted each other, dismissed each other's reportage, and it was often sniping as much as it was dialoguing, but there was a very lively rapport that exceeded just the local rapport that I sketched out for you. And that was really sort of a national conversation among German language newspapers.
Great. Another question here from Tyler Carrington, who's at Cornell College in Iowa. His question is, did all three papers you discuss have more or less the same sort of classified advertising? Perhaps most interestingly for me, marriage ads specifically. Can you observe any differences between ads in these three different sorts of German American dailies?
So they all carried classified ads, and superficially they did resemble each other. But if you look closely, and I must admit I didn't look terribly closely, because it was just, I was overwhelmed by the volume of material that I was researching. And so I had to basically make some hard decisions. And I decided that I liked the comic strips more than the classified ads, and that would be a chapter. But I did notice that if you look closely, the classified ads did reflect the sort of orientation of the three newspapers, which is to say that classified ads in the Hearst's German Journal, for example, might include ads looking for English language tutor, want to learn American, things of that nature, which showed sort of the Americanizing thrust of the newspaper and its readership, while for the Volkszeitung, there was often a sort of self-consciously working class or political angle to it. So there were definitely finely nuanced differences between them. Also in the Journal, more so than in the other two, again, you saw quite a bit of code switching in the classified ads. So there were often, you'd find the sort of an English language phrase or term thrown in as well. So as marriage ads, unfortunately, I never really came across any. But if you haven't yet, you definitely want to look into the Gallery of Lost Husbands feature of the Ford, which is really an amazing sort of public shaming of errant husbands.
Very interesting. So we've got another, this is a suggestion that's coming by way of Yogi Repman from Stefan Economides, who's in Boston and Berlin. He wrote his dissertation on Der Nationalsozialismus und die deutschsprachige Presse in New York 1933 bis 41. And then the comment here is sort of a suggestion, and this is obviously dealing with a period that's later than your area of focus. Die Redaktionsmeinung der in New York erscheinenden deutschsprachigen Zeitungen dem Phänomen des Nationalsozialismus gegenüber soll von der Machtübernahme der Nationalsozialisten bis zum Kriegseintritt der Vereinigten Staaten untersucht werden. Der Schwerpunkt der Untersuchung liegt bei der New Yorker Presse wegen der Pressekonzentration und der publizistischen Vielfalt. Nationalsozialistische, bürgerliche, sozialdemokratische und kommunistische Blätter wurden dort herausgegeben. Insbesondere wird die nationalsozialistische Presse berücksichtigt. So I don't know whether you...
And is that, I wonder if that is a summary of a work in progress, or is that...
I'm not sure whether this might be related to his dissertation. Der Nationalsozialismus.
I mean, you know, it would have been easy for me, and I probably should have, but didn't, write a sequel. And because, you know, I was in the groove anyway, and one of the two newspapers ceased existing, which eased my task considerably, and another one wouldn't make it to 1933, the Volkszeitung. So, you know, it would have been easy to continue charting this triangle and then later just two and then one-sided conversation and look at how the Staats-Zeitung, and some people have done this, not necessarily in the context of National Socialism, but look at how the Staats-Zeitung maneuvered through World War II. And Ronald Bayer has written a great book called Neighbors in Conflict some time ago, in which he looks at the Italian press, and he does quote also from the German press, and talks about the ways in which these immigrant groups, especially the ones whose countries of origin, Italy and Germany, ended up on the other side of the conflict from an American perspective, how they navigated once again the tricky waters of the United States going to war against countries of immigrants' origin. And generally, what he found, and what I would expect to find if I looked at the Staats-Zeitung, is that perhaps there was a first flush of enthusiasm in the 1920s for Mussolini and in the 1930s for National Socialism. But for the Germans in particular, I mean, they really learned the lesson of the repression in World War I. And as soon as the general tide of opinion turned against the Nazis, which was not immediate, of course, because there was a lot of infatuation with National Socialism, especially given, the Great Depression, and the Nazis seemed to have solved their own version thereof quite handily. But once, I think, as we get into 34, 35, 36, especially after 36, after the Olympic Games, which was the last big charm offensive of the Nazi regime, I think I would expect to find the Staats-Zeitung distancing itself very self-consciously from National Socialism, knowing full well that nothing good could come of it for them as an immigrant newspaper. So they, the World War I had been a very, very effective lesson for the German press, and they weren't going to stick their neck out a second time that far.
I have a question also, considering the incredibly long history of the New Yorker Staats-Zeitung, even though it's morphed into, now it's virtual phase, is there any kind of like archive or, materials, anything like materials that would be worthy of an archive that the various owners of the newspaper have maintained over the history of the paper?
It's a good question, and had I not been content to merely go through the archive that was most easily at my disposal, which were the microfilm reels at the New York Public Library and their newspaper collection, and they had the full run of the Staats-Zeitung going way back, maybe not as far back as 1834, but definitely into the 19th century. And they had the full run of the Volkszeitung as well during the period that I was looking at, day by day, and they had Hearst's German journal as well, which has since been lost, which is this unbelievable loss. And the reason it was lost, I'm sorry, I'm straying slightly from the question, I'll get back to it. The reason it was lost, I think, is because of the frequent change of titles. And so even back in the 1990s, when I was doing my daily pilgrimage for a long time to the New York Public Library, and you'd get your reels and you could put them on reserve for a certain number of days so they wouldn't return them to the vault. But ultimately they would return them and then they get the next stack for you. And they always had difficulty finding the newspaper, and I'd say, well, look under this, look under deutsches, under D for Deutsches Journal, or under M for Morgenjournal, or under N for New Yorker Deutsches Journal. And anyways, it was always a bit of a runaround, but they had the whole run through 1918, although nothing before 1911, because I found this a little tidbit in the newspaper. I was very pleased with myself. According to a small report in the journal, the entire existing back copies of the journal had perished in an office fire in 1911. So I don't know if that's why the New York Public Library didn't have anything before 1911, but they didn't, and those two facts seem to dovetail very nicely. But in any case, they lost them. And because I've since had many people come to me and say, I want to read the journal as well. I want to look at this or that angle. How does it, deal with the construction of race, for example? Another thing I did not have the wherewithal to look at, even though it was definitely there. There was a whole thing about the Allies have like all these, colored troops from Africa and India, whereas German troops are white. And I failed to recognize its significance. It was a bit before that turn to the construction of race in the academy. But in any case, I was content to work with the archive at my disposal, and I never thought to ask for Frau Anna's paper or Oswald Ottendorfer's paper. I'm sure that they are somewhere, actually. I mean, they were huge. As far as these more obscure socialist figures are concerned, they left few traces. The historian of the German socialist press in America is Carol Poor, is her name. Wonderful book. I think it's called something like the German American Socialist Press.
She was trained in Madison in our department.
Oh, was she really? Well, that's a great book. But so she would be the person to ask. But yeah, no. So I'm sure there's stuff on the Ottendorfers. There must be. They were influential. They were powerful. They were rich. They left behind air. Well, you know what? They didn't, because Frau Anna was, of course, too old to have any children. She was already widowed, and this was her second marriage, and she was quite advanced in middle age. She died long before Oswald. So I'm not sure that they actually had any children. But in any case, there's probably some collections out there somewhere.
Well, that looks like all the, let me see, we have maybe one more. Oh, we have one more question here. This is coming from Lee Richardson. And we're moving from the 1930s to the 18th century now. In 1778, Christopher Sauer Jr. was arrested for treason and his property seized by the Continental Army for his promotion of pacifism in his German newspaper in Philadelphia. He was a pacifist. Was the purpose of government censoring the 1915 newspapers to actually shut them down?
Right. So now, I really looked into this in some detail, and I think it was an unspoken purpose. So I think it's very hard for us today to imagine, although perhaps a little more so now than it was 25 years ago when I was really immersed in this research. It's difficult to imagine the degree of diversity and linguistic diversity in America 100 years ago from our vantage point today. It was unbelievably multilingual, polyglot nation. And I think this was definitely by immigration restrictionists, other social conservatives, and what at the time during the war were known as 100% Americans, right? These super patriots. they considered this diversity to be a threat, effectively. I mean, the post-war period is almost immediately followed by very severe immigration restriction, and the seeds of that were during the war these laws, the Trading with the Enemy Act, which I quoted from, but also its sort of sister acts of Congress, the Sedition Act, not the old Civil War era Sedition Act, but the 1917 Sedition Act and the Espionage Act. They were really designed to squelch dissent and alternate views, or alternative views, I should say, of the accepted politics of the war period. And it was clearly understood that a lot of this dissent was being articulated in the foreign language press. And so the law made it extraordinarily difficult for the newspapers to actually satisfy its demands, which were these daily, for the foreign language press, translating each article, filing it with the postmaster, having their translators vet its accuracy, and then going to the censor in order to be approved. The whole idea was to slow down the news to such an effect that by the time the reader gets the news, it's already 10 days out of date. So they're going to gravitate towards the English language press or those ethnic newspapers like the Staats-Zeitung that are carrying the government vetted news, right? And so, I discovered in my research that there was a particular peculiarity that I was unaware of originally, that if for any reason there was a delay in the regular the regular publication of any newspaper, foreign language or English language, and it skipped an edition, and for some reason, Tuesday's newspaper, we just can't get it off the presses, so we'll be back on Wednesday. And of course, there were such delays all the time because of this onerous process that I described. Then it automatically forfeited its second-class mailing privileges. And it was all, that was, for all these ethnic newspapers, that was really the main base of their income. It wasn't newsstand sales, it was subscribers. So once they lost their second-class mailing privileges, the cost became prohibitively high to use the mail, and they could no longer reach their readers. So I can only conclude, going back to the question, that, at some level, that really was the intention. And the outcome was that these laws, by the way, stayed on the books until 1921. They were emergency wartime laws, but they actually didn't end with the war, and they were used then post-war to clean up, having sort of silenced the Germans, to clean up the Wobblies and the radicals and the Unionists and all the other suspect Americans who had somehow made it through. And then if you look at the numbers, and Robert Park in the Immigrant Press and Its Control does a great job on this. He has this wonderful table in which he shows you how many Italian, Romanian, Hungarian, German, and all of the different languages for each year, how many newspapers were being published in America. And then the totals and the decline is astonishing. So after 1920, we're looking at maybe 1/3 of the total number that was being published before 1917. So I do think that this was a pretty self-conscious and intentional effort to basically silence dissent, and based on the assumption that much of that dissent was foreign language based.
Right. Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Peter, for taking the time to join us this evening. It's been a real treat, and I am grateful to all the folks that have come this evening or tuned in this evening, and
Thank you.
hope to see everybody at future Max Kade virtual lectures. So thanks very much.
Great.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, Mark.